and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast series. On Friday last week, the Indian Prime Minister, in a surprise move, announced the repeal of the controversial farm laws that were passed in Parliament in September of 2020 and led to one of perhaps the longest farmers' agitations that the country has witnessed. The agitations and the public debate that unfolded over this last 1 year brought agriculture back into the front and center of public discourse and debates on the future of the Indian economy. But of course, it came with very polarizing views on what was needed for the agriculture sector, what the farmers' protests meant, who they represented, what they represented, which voices were being heard, and the politics of agricultural reform ought to look like. In the repeal of these laws, there has been much debate on the political implications and also the political motivations behind the choice of this repeal. There's also been a lot of discussion on farmers' voices and what this means for the future of agricultural reforms for India. But behind all of this are deep and serious questions about agriculture, what it means for the Indian economy, what it means for Indian society, what agriculture means for the Indian farmer, and what these protests brought to the table for both our public understandings of the Indian farmer and agriculture, and what future directions the policy discourse ought to take. I'm Yamini Aiyar, President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research. And joining me to understand events of this last 1 year, their implications, unpack the implications of the laws themselves and why they generated the response they did from farmers and the public, and to discuss where we need to go, are India's two leading experts, and I'm proud to say members of the CPR faculty, Mekhala Krishnamurthy and Harish Damodaran, both of whom know more about Indian agriculture than most. Thank you both for joining me. Harish, let me start with you, because I think our listeners will be very curious to understand what your take is in terms of why these laws needed to be repealed. What was it that pushed the political and policy establishment to take this unexpected and relatively significant call? And what implications does this have for the narrative that is now emerging amongst the farmers' movements and protests on where the political and policy debate on agricultural reforms should rest?
Yamini, I believe that this movement was not a movement of poor farmers or rich farmers. Okay? And it was not a pan-national movement either. This was largely a movement of the middle peasantry. Okay? Middle peasantry of basically Punjab, Haryana and Western UP. You can call it the greater Jat peasantry. Okay? Most farmer movements in India have always been led by the middle peasantry. I mean, this goes back to even Kheda and which was largely a movement of the Patidar peasantry. Here, I would say that this was movement largely of the Jat peasantry, okay? And this is a middle class. This is not; they are not poor, they are not rich. Okay, and today many problems which you are facing today has to do with the problem of the middle. Okay, and the fact that this particular middle class, this rural middle class, experienced some brief spells of prosperity, especially post the Green Revolution, when you had this entire system of procurement at MSPs, etc. So this was not a movement of small peasants, small farmers, marginal farmers, etc. You can call this as a revolt of the maybe 5 to 10 acre farmer. Who were by and large the main participants in this particular movement.
But Harish, let me ask you this, because it is a common perception, certainly amongst the commentariat, that this movement was very much about the rich Punjab and Haryana farmer. You're making a very important distinction here between the rich farmer and the middle peasantry. So just for our listeners, if you could just explain that a little bit more, and also why you say that this protest and movement was really about the middle peasantry and not so much the rich peasantry.
Yeah, see, in this particular belt, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, etc., you have assured irrigation. You have water. Okay, and they have been basically producing paddy, wheat, and sugarcane, which are covered under some kind of a minimum support price scheme. In the case of sugarcane, they call it the state advised price. So mills have to pay the price which is fixed by the government. There is a statutory obligation. And in the case of wheat and paddy, it's not a statutory obligation, but it's an implicit kind of a guarantee, right? That whatever paddy and wheat the farmers of Punjab and Haryana bring to the mandis will be bought by the government agencies. So the farm laws were basically about this particular arrangement. The APMC mandis where farmers bring their paddy and wheat. And it is bought by the government agencies. So the farm laws that is how it was understood by this section. Okay, so today, whatever, because of the crisis or whatever, maybe fiscal resources, many things, right? I mean, you're buying paddy and wheat at say 1,900, 2,000 rupees, and then you're distributing the same at 2 rupees, 3 rupees. This obviously is creating a lot of fiscal stress. There is also a lot of environmental stress, etc. Right? And the government trying to find a solution, and probably I think the government was trying to say that here are whatever rich farmers. I mean, of course, the government is not saying that openly, but that was what the commentariat and plus the ruling party and it's saying, that rich farmers, and we are undertaking these reforms for the small and marginal farmers, and for some reason the small and marginal farmers have not come out to the streets, saying that, hey, why have these laws been repealed? They have not come to the streets, and neither and the guys who have been on the streets are the so-called rich farmers who didn't understand. I mean, the Prime Minister was not able to convince them. So I think Mekhala will be able to explain this much better.
Mekhala, I think it'll be useful for our listeners to get a sense from you on who are the small farmers, and also your perspective on whether this really was a movement of rich farmers, as the commentariat like to present to us. Harish makes the important point that this is actually about the crisis that confronts India's middle peasantry, that is the bulk of what is in fact the Indian peasant whose household income is significantly dependent on agriculture. And to Harish's point also that ultimately it seems as though there were almost no takers for this law from amongst India's agricultural community stakeholders, because the rich farmers, the middle farmers were on the streets. Maybe some small farmers were on the streets too, but once the laws have been repealed, there is no counter movement either. So just to understand, how has agriculture, the agriculturist, the real farmer, viewed these so-called reforms that were meant to be in their interests and which our political class has not been able to convince them of, which is the narrative we get to hear?
Yamini, I think it's so interesting because there were, two parts to the speech. The first part was a 15 minutes or so where the Prime Minister was talking about small and marginal farmers, but he wasn't talking to them. There was a particular moment where he actually said, can you imagine that 80 out of 100 farmers have less than 2 hectares? This is not something that India's farmers need to imagine. They live this reality every single day. So when he says, can you imagine, it is an address really to the middle class and to urban citizen rather than to the agrarian citizen who actually lives with a very small landholding and understands this. He then went on to portray, this farmer as a person who is completely dependent on this less than 2 hectares of land, and from this they run their entire lives. And we know actually from a lot of recent data that Harish and I have been looking at carefully, and many others have also been commenting about the situational analysis survey, that India's small and marginal farmers depend greatly on non-agricultural income. And so these are already a diversified group of people. They are deeply connected to agriculture. Yes, they farm, often for their own consumption. They also participate, in a whole range of local markets. There is, as Harish's work has shown, a lot of livestock and poultry cultivation as well. But these are not farmers who are only dependent on farming. Right. And this was the imagination that was being portrayed, that these are the people for whom this law has really been brought to the fore. In the end of his speech, he then addressed the farmers he thought would be listening, who are, the farmers who have been protesting, predominantly from Punjab, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh, Western Uttar Pradesh, who are larger farmers because farm holding sizes in these states are also larger. So actually, from these states, it was a regional movement where you saw large and small farmers both come out, and you saw a lot of solidarity amongst all elements. And the reason for that is that because Punjab and Haryana and Western Uttar Pradesh have typically larger landholdings, particularly Punjab and Haryana, these are states where all farmers go to mandis and have the benefit of price support. Right. So actually, in this state, even though it's the larger farmers who appear sometimes and come out, and we have this imagination, Punjab itself has small farmers, and they also depend on mandis and MSP. So it's more a regional context in which the laws, which were about APMC mandis, and triggered a fear that it was about the withdrawal of all kinds of state support, predominantly the MSP, for these farmers really resonated. And it was to these farmers that the Prime Minister said I was unable to persuade and urge them to now head home. But what struck me was, I think the vast majority of Indian farmers, this 86%, would not have really even understood that the laws had been brought, debated, and now repealed. The vast majority of these farmers across India do not have the benefit of going to APMC mandis. Forget being trapped in exchange in APMC mandis. Most of them never reach those mandis. For decades, both state governments and through central policies, we have never created enough mandis for them. Those mandis are not well functioning in most parts of this country. Where they do exist, it is again middle farmers, generally larger, medium-sized and large farmers, who actually make it to the mandi. It's often aggregators who make it to the mandi. And small farmers are securely, actually, due to structural constraints. This is not a legal barrier. They could have accessed mandis, but they actually were never able to access mandis. So most of these farmers sell in villages, into small traders, intermediaries, commission agents, millers, all across the country. But don't actually necessarily participate in mandi level exchange, depending on the commodity that they're trading in and exchanging in. So I think just one anecdote to give you a sense of this. Many years ago, in work that we were doing with the anthropologist Jeff Witso, this was years after Bihar had actually abolished its APMC Act. He went to talk to farmers in Ara and Bhojpur, and they didn't know that the mandi had been abolished. They had never gone there before, and they certainly were not going there now. They continued to sell at the village level to village traders. So I think for many farmers in India, these laws, are an episode that nobody would have even realized had been brought. They were not addressing the deep structural constraints that face Indian farmers.
Thank you, Mekhala and Harish. I think you really put the agitations into perspective and have given us a really good sense of who it is that came to the streets and why. And it's a very important corrective to the assumptions that are being made in the sort of public interpretation of these protests, that these are spoiled rich brat farmers, on the one hand, who are protesting to save their own vested entrenched interests at the cost of other farmers who may benefit from the laws. And secondly, that in fact, maybe there is a much bigger conversation that we need to have about agricultural reform that goes beyond what these laws were trying to achieve. So, would it be fair for me to interpret what both of you are saying as much ado about nothing for the bulk of Indian farmers, but the laws were going to significantly undermine the sort of insurance and price structure and market structure that middle and rich farmers in one region of India were used to, and that the vulnerabilities of those farmers, as you said, Harish, especially the middle peasantry who have gone through deep distress, is what was most visible in the course of the protest. Would that be a fair interpretation?
Yeah, I would say that generally the middle peasantry in India has been facing this crisis. And you can see it not just with the Jats, but even with the Marathas, with the Patidars, with the Kapus, And today we don't have, the problem with government policy is we don't have the policy for the middle. It's either for the absolutely poor, or it is complete handouts for the corporates. Today there is a crisis not just among the farmers, but even the small traders, the so-called what are much reviled commission agents, right? So there is a problem today of the middle, whether it is the urban middle class, whether it is the rural middle class, and sooner or later, I think policy has to come to terms with the fact that there is this middle problem which has to be addressed, and you cannot just rub it aside, and as Mekhala was saying, that the poor farmers hardly sell much. They don't have much of a surplus, right? And they tend to sell it off to the village level trader itself, right? I mean, to the village level vyapari. So when we talk of APMC, when we talk of MSP, all these things have meaning only to maybe, I don't know, I mean, the kind of estimates which we have done, maybe about 4 crore farmers, and not the 15 crore and 10 crore kind of farmers. So it is, and we need a solution for these 4 crore farmers, and which is the case, I think, across the entire political economy of India, and if the middle class, if the middle class is not feeling, middle class is a very dynamic element, if the middle
and
class
diverse.
Diverse. If the middle class is in a crisis, it has many other problems, and probably the Modi government has been thinking that we can go directly to the poor, the poorest of the poor. We can just look at them because they are also larger in numbers, so we don't need to bother beyond a point. And I think that is what is today. There is a pushback from the middle which is happening.
But let me come back to you. I think you've given us a really important segue into the next segment of what I wanted to talk about, which is what next. But before we get there, while you're right that we make policy for the rich, we make policy for the poor, but in some ways, where the sort of current juncture is putting us into a funny conundrum, because the agitation itself is now moving towards MSP as the most critical next step that they're asking for. Is that MSP really going to address this challenge of the middle? And how do you interpret this emphasis on the MSP that is coming out of the movements at the moment?
I think the government unnecessarily invested too much of political capital in the 3 farm laws, because I think the longer this dragged on, it whetted the appetite among these farmers, ultimately, and what has happened is, if you asked me 10 years ago, farmers other than Punjab and Haryana, this very narrow section, they didn't know about MSP. Okay, the idea of an MSP, minimum support price, but today, I think every farmer in India knows what an MSP is, and it is more some kind of a thing that, our costs are going up, like diesel prices have gone up, and all through this agitation, the diesel prices went up, and fertilizer prices went up. Right. So during a time, so I think this consciousness that, our costs are increasing. Okay, but when we are selling, we are not getting a reasonable price. The idea that we need to have a reasonable price, and somehow also the idea that it should be 50% above our cost. I think this is something which is now permanently ingrained itself into the minds of not just, I think, the farmers who protested in these who were part of this protest, but also farmers in other parts of India who would have identified with this whole thing. So today, this is probably some kind of a collateral casualty.
Yeah.
You create, you invest so much of political capital in the farm laws, and today farmers say, okay, fine, you repeal them, but now we want more. And that is very dangerous.
Mekhala, curious to both hear your views on the MSP demand, but you've also argued that the interpretation of what market reform should be, as stated in the law, how the law understood the dynamism and the diversity of markets, and how the law understood regulation itself were problematic, particularly from the perspective of the small farmers. So just wanted to hear your views on those, because we will talk about where next in the next segment.
So, I just to respond a little to Harish, because I think, it is very important to understand why this gathering momentum around MSP. And I think he's absolutely right to also point out that over the last, 15 years, I would say, and certainly from 2008 onward, but even a little before, you started seeing state governments also pick up on the idea of decentralized procurement. So, it is not just Punjab and Haryana, but of course, during the lockdown, many people pointed out Madhya Pradesh actually procured more wheat than Punjab, and Chhattisgarh has been, very prominently, part of the paddy procurement story. So has Odisha. Andhra Pradesh, Telangana. So you actually, right now we have this fight in Telangana over paddy procurement and the center's resistance and sort of putting limits on how much paddy it will buy. So I think the understanding, the association and the demand for MSP is much, much greater amongst farmers than the demand and understanding for a well-regulated and competitive market. Mm-hmm. Now, actually, both are very, very important, and they are related, but they are also separate in the terms when you think about government policy. You have to understand their relationship, but you have to understand that they play very different roles in farmers' lives. MSP and price procurement policy, and we know this, and we've had these conversations for years now, and emerged out of a very particular historical context. And the whole program was designed to give farmers assured markets so that it would boost production of paddy and wheat. So not surprisingly, that is precisely what it has done. It has sustained the production of paddy and wheat cultivation in agroecological areas like Punjab and Haryana, where paddy at least should not be cultivated. And at this scale, certainly. And in other states as well, right? It has re-emphasized the focus on paddy and wheat. And it's only more recently that we are now seeing a real imagination about, shall we think about pulse procurement? What about millets and oil seeds? And those are the, commodities in which we must do this much more fully. There's also, of course, been an old history of procurement in cotton, and in sugarcane, it's a very different system. So, agricultural policy has really been very cereal centric, and it has prioritized these water intensive crops, including sugarcane, and then it has, focused on cotton. So I think, the fact that so many farmers relate to it is contextual. It has happened over the last 15 years. We've seen more of this come on the ground into people's lives. And there is a big difference between the prices you get from procurement and what you get in the open market for these farmers. So they can see a clear difference between the prices you get if you participate in the system. So I think there is a larger demand. My concern there is that unless we shift the focus away from the current system, right? And, the other very interesting thing about this entire farm law debate is that the debate has been anti-APMC laws, right? The APMC law is actually an incredibly poorly implemented law across most parts of this country. We never actually invested adequately. And the government's own Doubling Farmers' Incomes report has mentioned this in a lot of detail. We never invested in the infrastructure required. We never invested in the regulatory capacity required in mandis. We didn't build mandis in most parts of this country that are actually good and functional. We never delivered on that first generation of promise. And yet the obsession is with the APMC law. MSP, interestingly, has never had a law, right? And yet it has actually dominated farmers' experience on the ground, right? And it's only in Punjab and Haryana where you see the two come together. Not even in UP, because actually UP's mandis do not function like Punjab's and Haryanas. These are the only two states where MSP and mandi are inextricably linked, right? In many other states, MSP procurement is done through primary agricultural cooperative societies or done through LAMPs. It's not done through mandis. So in those places, farmers didn't see a change in APMC law as connected to the removal of the MSP. Right, necessarily. But in Punjab and Haryana, where the procurement happens in the mandi, the idea that the mandi might disappear, it happens through artyas, that you're trying to bypass artyas. Farmers have never engaged in a different kind of procurement system. So, in Madhya Pradesh, procurement is happening in village cooperative society, same in Odisha. So they don't have the same association between MSP and mandi. And personally, I think that that's actually a good thing for the direction of reforms, because we need much more decentralized systems. We don't have to have a mandi-centric vision of procurement if we need it. You can prioritize crops that are agroecologically sensitive, crops that are much more important nutritionally. You can put them in the PDS, you can use them for ICDS, for midday meals. So there is a way in which you can do a much, much more locally responsive and regional imagination of MSP. I really worry that this imagination of agriculture as a legal problem has taken over. It has taken over the imagination of reformers who think you have to deregulate, and it's taken over the imagination of farmers who think you have to legislate. And it's problematic on both sides. I don't think a legal entitlement to MSP is going to actually be easy to design or deliver in a way that will actually meet the requirements of farmers. I think we can do it through policy. I think we can do it through better local institutions, state institutions, a much more coordinated, sort of approach to procurement. And that would actually be much more effective. On the other hand, where you actually need good regulation and you need much better understanding of markets so that you can regulate them effectively in the interests of farmers and of Indian consumers, we are actually taking this deregulatory approach, where we are saying, let's leave the market to its own devices. And that is not a good policy direction for markets which are, have deep asymmetries. So, I can explain this more, we can discuss in more detail, but this is what I think is that, so the problem that we've had in the last year is that we now think there is a legal problem and a legal solution on both ends. And I think we've got our analysis wrong.
Thanks, Mekhala. I think you get to the heart of where I wanted to take this conversation next, which was how do we reframe the reform question now? Because it isn't anybody's case, and not even the case of the protesting farmers, that the status quo is an acceptable one. Things need to change. So Harish, Mekhala says, we've sort of converted this very real problem of how markets function in the real economy, which needs a balancing act between state, market, private interest, farmers' interests, into a legal problem on both sides. And that's going to bind us into a place where we may end up worse off than the status quo. Your thoughts on where we need to go?
I think there are two things which, we can consider looking ahead. One is, instead of a minimum support price, can we give some kind of a minimum income support to the farmers? Okay, that farmers should be entitled to a minimum income rather than just a minimum support. In fact, my fear is if you make MSP legal and you can actually deliver it by the government buying up everything at the MSP. But which is not sustainable in any case. So maybe a better thing would be to guarantee a minimum income rather than a minimum support price to the farmer. Whatever, whether it is nyaya or whatever, some kind of a framework for that. Maybe farmers can be one way in which you can try out some kind of a minimum income. And the second thing has to do with crop planning. Like for example, Punjab. Say 30 lakh hectares under paddy and 35 lakh hectares under wheat. Can we have, say, a 5-year plan, whichever the government comes in Punjab, next time, over 5 years, can we reduce the paddy area from 30 lakh hectares to 15 lakh hectares? Okay, halving it. And out of that 15 lakh hectares, say 5 lakh hectares would be under basmati. Okay, and only the remaining 10 lakh hectares would be under non-basmati paddy. And where you would, instead of having transplanting, you would have direct seeded rice, right? So you save on water. You have shorter duration. Okay, so what do you do now to the remaining 15 lakh hectares? Okay, is it possible for, say, some of that area to come under, say, arhar? Okay, some area to come under soybean, under cotton, under this thing, and maybe you will have to continue with procurement. Okay, you cannot say that the Punjab farmer we will not procure. That's not possible. It's like telling the Kerala ration card holder, no, we cannot, because we have to also give free grain to poorer states, to Jharkhand, to the same. See, once somebody has got an entitlement, you cannot withdraw it, but you can modify it. You can make the same Punjab farmer grow arhar. Maybe varieties which are amenable to mechanical harvesting. Right, and instead of getting, say, 7 tons of paddy, I get, say, 2 tons of arhar, right? And I am given a price which is reasonable. So instead of having rice shellers, rice mills, you can have dal mills. So maybe the same Punjab, which started growing non-basmati rice from 1970, can now start growing dal. So I think you need to bring in crop planning. Whether you can have crop planning. That is wean away farmers from growing, too water-intensive crops. Okay, even in the case of, say, wheat, definitely Punjab should continue growing wheat because not many states can grow wheat. Okay, but instead of 35 lakh hectares, say, bring it down to 30 lakh hectares, and this has to be part of a national plan. Okay, we got the farmers in Punjab to grow wheat and paddy for us. So the center has to play a key role in weaning away the farmers from growing these crops, but grow more pulses, and we should take into account for the fact that these farmers are a very precious human resource. Okay, we cannot say that the Punjab farmer should move away from farming. Let them farm; they should farm, and so we need a policy, national level policy for the farmer of Punjab, Haryana, so-called rich farmers.
Mekhala, I think Harish makes an important case in a sense for continued state intervention, both at the national level, specifically for Punjab, Haryana, but also a broader national agriculture policy that recognizes many of the challenges he points out. He also talks about the need for more income support rather than minimum support. So a different kind of state support, but the state doesn't go out of the way. And you argued that when we talk about market reforms and agriculture, our imagination takes us straight to deregulation, which is all about getting the state out of the way, whereas again, even for markets, we need to keep the state firmly in place. So your thoughts on specifically one or two specific things. What does it mean for the state to actually be in markets without, I'm assuming, because you speak in the language of reform, so you're not talking about an old system of state control. So what would that mean, just for our listener to understand before we go to closing comments?
I think it's really important because we tend to talk a lot about the state, and the Shetkari Sanghatna always, they're big thing. They always say that it's about, we talk about all the other kinds of risks that farmers face, but one of the greatest risks they face is government intervention. And they're not wrong in saying this, because what happens in markets is that typically when there are two big balancing acts that the state has historically had to do in markets, right, in agricultural markets. The first is between producers and consumers. And that's a rural and urban story, and it's also, of course, a story for rural India as well. So it's the consumer and producer dynamic. And as Harish has been also saying, there is also the economy and agroecology dynamic. And these are things that markets will not resolve on their own. You could take the view that eventually when water tables dry out, when you can no longer produce something, when demand shifts, markets will readjust and prices will fall. But the damage of that, kind of over extraction is profound. And it's not easy to compensate for that. So I think a free-for-all in these sectors where you have a very large number of poor people who actually depend on the state for food security and at least support their food security through the state, as well as when you have these kind of very complex agroecological problems and challenges and resources that we must protect, there is no doubt the state has to play an important role. I also agree with Harish that it does need to be national as a vision, because in India we have a few states that produce a lot of certain commodities. And even within those states, it's often few districts which produce those commodities, and then they move across quite a long distance. In the case of some commodities, others are much more locally produced and consumed. So, it does need to, you do have to take into account a national picture. However, I am slightly nervous about when we think about the role of the center. I feel this whole thing has to really place the states front and center. And we have to decentralize at the right level. Right? You can't decentralize only at the village level. Yeah. Markets are not like that. They don't function in this way. You cannot determine that every market village will have a mandi, or every 5 kilometers you will have a mandi. These are dynamic structures, and their scales work at different ways depending on demand, depending on supply, depending on access, processing, etc. So my sense is that you cannot do this without strong participation and leadership from the states, and then within them the right kinds of institutions. We've gone completely against any, you say regional planning, people think you're back in some socialist era, and then this is all going to be some terrible dystopia. But I don't see how we can go ahead without thinking about the role of both states and decentralized systems. But we may have to be much more creative about scale. I really worry that because we don't understand how markets work, we will over-determine where infrastructure should be put. We will over-determine where credit is really required. It requires a lot of dynamism. That's actually why informal systems over these years have adapted, and they're quick, they're flexible, they're agile. They're also poorly financed, very risky, and can be exploitative. But they have adapted to these systems, right? And now we cannot over-determine them with some understanding of scale. At the same time, I do think public regulation is very important in these markets. And this is something that, we keep forgetting. You have to look at the market structure. When it comes to agriculture and food markets, these are markets where typically you have a very large number of small sellers who sell to a small number of local intermediaries or local buyers. And at the other hand, you have a very large number of poor consumers, right, who are depending on local retail, etc. So market power in such a system is a real issue and needs to be understood carefully. I think in India, we have such a vast country. How will anybody consolidate other than the state? Right? And the biggest consolidator is the state, not even wrong there, don't disagree. But I do think that, all our experience from other countries who also thought they were too vast to get centralized and consolidated is that market power is a real problem. It's a problem locally where a few buyers, a small number of large buyers can cartelize. And we've all seen these cartels operate inside APMCs, outside APMCs, in markets where there are APMCs, where there are no APMCs. So we need to get better at building systems and strengthening farmers' participation in these markets. whether that is through farmers collectives, different kinds of organizations, making sure they're not dependent on the same people for credit as they are for sales, etc. So there's a whole set of things that you can do to strengthen participation of farmers in these markets. But we also need to regulate these markets. You need to know who these people are. You need to have minimal standards of registration, etc. Market intelligence is so critical. These are markets where there's a lot of asymmetry of information, and all countries invest publicly in building better systems. We've had AgMarkNet, but how effective is it for farmers? Yeah, can't we really improve these systems considerably?
Yeah.
So my concern was none of this was really discussed and put out when we discussed the farm laws. No new thinking and creative thinking was put in place here. And the assumption was that if you just deregulate, leave everything to the market, these problems will be resolved, companies will come in, corporates will take over, they will come in with public investments. And there is very little evidence that that would happen. And there's a lot of risk with that, that kind of understanding.
Thanks. That was a very important overview of what we mean when we talk about the role of the state, and in particular, how the state can actually effectively regulate without completely getting in the way or getting out of the way. We're coming close to the end of our discussion, but I wanted to turn to you, Harish, to ask both just your last thoughts on, there's a committee that has been set up, or it has been proposed to be set up, as the Prime Minister said in his speech, which presumably is going to take a re-look at the debate on agriculture reforms. If you had a wish list of two things that you think the committee should deliberate on, away from the sort of contours that were set by the farm laws themselves, what would those two things be? And Mekhala, heads up, I'm going to come to you with that question too.
I think the foremost thing which we need to think of is an incomes policy for farmers. Some way of assuring them a minimum income so that they continue to farm. Okay. And let me repeat the same thing, and when they farm, it is desirable that they grow crops which are suited, which the country needs. Right. So there should be some kind of a link between agriculture and nutrition. Okay. I believe that unlike in the 60s, India was a ship to mouth existence. There was nothing. We had nothing. Today, we have some kind of a luxury of surpluses. It's easier to plan when there are surpluses. You can play around. You can ask the farmer, hey, don't grow this crop, grow something else. Whereas that was not the case 50 years ago, and actually today's policymakers should read what was happening during that time. It was actually a crisis, there was a problem of getting anything, you were short of everything, whether sugar, milk, wheat, there was nothing. Whereas today you can play around, you can tell the farmer you grow this much. So I think the main thing is we should start thinking in terms of an incomes policy for the farmers, and you couple it with crop planning and linking it with nutrition. I think this is what any committee or rather commission should be doing today. And thankfully now the farm laws off the way. I think that's a very welcome move, because at least now it brings some kind of a trust. And I can tell you, no solution in India is possible without the Punjab and Haryana farmer. You may hate him, you may think he's rich and all these things, but he has the solution. I can tell you the solution can come only from there.
Interesting that, Harish, you didn't mention the word markets in the two things that you had to say. So maybe our framing was wrong and we need to reframe and reimagine. Mekhala?
I would say the committee should listen and really learn from what we've experienced, what the different kinds of data are telling us about two things. One is about the role of the state in agriculture and the critical role the state has to play in shaping this role. It's not about an overbearing role, but both in terms of having an understanding of why it is important to have good public regulation in agricultural markets, the kind of public investment that is required when you have very deep asymmetries and structural inequalities in these markets. Taking a position and that understands the diversity that we're dealing with, and the differentiation before it leaps into this idea of diversification, right? People are already diversifying, but they're diversifying in ways that reflect their distress rather than reflecting opportunity. And we need to change that from distress-driven diversification to one that is really surplus sustained, so that agriculture can be a multiplier. So I think the most important thing for the committee is twofold. One is to understand the importance and the right role of the state in the market. The second is to understand the role of agriculture in Indian society and economy. And this is really complex because we've talked a lot about large and small farmers. I think it's not for us to determine how much or who or what a farmer does. Farmers have historically made very complex choices based on their locations. Some would want to continue farming, many would want to diversify, some would want to continue and diversify. There are a whole range of things that will be happening here that are already happening. So I think understanding the relationship between the agrarian and the non-agrarian, how to make agriculture really a multiplier when it comes to both livelihood opportunities and enterprise, as well as at the heart of our food systems, right? So you are going to have to think much more creatively. I think we've been very heavy-handed. In some ways, we think the state is all over Indian agriculture, but the state is in all the wrong places. And with a long imagination, it needs to change where it is and how. And I think that imagination has to be one of public investment. One last quick point. We've talked a lot about this Green Revolution belt. And one of the things is that we have now learned our lessons from the Green Revolution. I think getting caught into a procurement policy that is never ending, getting caught into this monocropping cycle, the one, size fits all, the package approach, over intensification of farming, all of this, we've learned these lessons. But what we haven't learned is that the Green Revolution, the transformation that happened, actually happened because of public investment. It happened because of coordination. It didn't happen because of a law. It happened because we invested in public agricultural science. And it happened because we invested in institutions. If we don't do this going forward, where we understand that there are complex interests, but there are also lots of very challenging shared interests, I think we'll fail. So, that's a large task for them. But I think if we just keep repeating the mistakes and trying to solve these quick fix problems in agriculture, we'll fail.
So perhaps there is a silver lining in this saga of ordinances to laws to protests to lives lost and repeals of laws that have dominated headlines over the last year and a half. At one level, it has brought agriculture back into the public discourse. We had forgotten about agriculture. We had assumed, as both of you, Mekhala and Harish, have reminded me again and again, we had assumed the best agricultural policy for India was to ignore agriculture entirely and get people out of agriculture. But now I think we recognize that the best agriculture policy is one that tackles agriculture front and center. And also perhaps that we need a new vocabulary for thinking about reforms for agriculture. And Harish and Mekhala, both of you have presented us with a very, very important set of starting points for where the debate needs to go and for what the committee has to do. We can only hope that your sensible voices will make their way into some of the thinking in the policy landscape and the public landscape on these issues. Thank you so much for joining us on India Speak. And I'm sure we'll be back again to discuss the next phase of what unfolds, hopefully with a renewed imagination and renewed hope. Thank you. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and on our website www.cprindia.org.